Berlin did not begin as a wall. It began as a ruin. In 1945, the Red Army took a city of smashed stone and hollow eyes and planted its flag on the Reichstag. Germany was partitioned into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet, and Berlin, deep inside the Soviet zone, was split the same way into 4 sectors. The Allies had agreed on this in rooms far from the rubble. On the ground, agreements depended on trains that ran, trucks that could find bridges, and officers who could read a map without reading a threat into it. At first, cooperation held by inertia. Trams rattled across sector lines. Berliners bartered cigarettes for potatoes. Allied patrols nodded across checkpoints that were not yet walls. But the grand coalition that had beaten Hitler unstitched itself with startling speed. In 1947-48, Washington pumped dollars into a flattened Western Europe under the Marshall Plan. Moscow called it a bribe. Western zones in Germany prepared a currency reform to stop runaway inflation. The Soviets saw a separate Western state being born. In June 1948, the USSR cut off road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin, betting the city would starve or the West would back down. The gamble met a different sort of answer: the Berlin airlift. For almost a year, American and British planes, C-47s, C-54s, the candy bomber that dropped sweets to children, flew in everything a city needs to live: coal, flour, machine parts, medicine. At peak, one plane landed at Tempelhof or Gatto every few minutes, wheels on the runway, brakes smoking, cargo out, wheels up, back through the corridor again. Engineers built a new airfield at Tegel in record time. West Berliners rationed, queued, and kept faith. East Berliners watched the sky fill with evidence that lines on maps could be defied by machines and will. In May 1949, the blockade ended. It had failed, but it left a truth hanging over the city. Berlin was where global tensions took physical form. 2 Germanys followed quickly: the Federal Republic of Germany, FRG, West Germany in May 1949, and the German Democratic Republic, GDR, East Germany in October. Their capitals, Bonn and East Berlin, spoke different languages of legitimacy and economics. In the GDR, the SED, Socialist Unity Party, consolidated power. Land reform redistributed estates. Heavy industry was rebuilt to Soviet models. The Ministry for State Security, the Stasi, grew from a headquarters into a net. In the West, a social market economy took off. The D-Mark became a symbol of stability. West Berlin received subsidies and status as a showcase of democratic prosperity inside the Soviet sphere. If you wanted proof of which system people chose with their feet, you looked at the trains and the sidewalks. Between 1949 and 1961, roughly 2.7 million people left East Germany, and more than half of them slipped out through Berlin. Why Berlin? Because even after the inner German border hardened into fences and mines, the city remained a loophole. You could ride the S-Bahn across sector lines, step from east to west on a sidewalk, or get off one stop later and never look back. Doctors, engineers, skilled workers, and students, the brain drain, walked away from the GDR's future. Families split. A mother would cross with a suitcase and return only in letters. In East Berlin, you could watch West Berliners buying oranges under neon signs and feel the ache of comparison. In West Berlin, you could see East Berliners lining up for ration cards under the gaze of a poster that promised a radiant tomorrow, and feel the weight of a different kind of hunger. The East German state tightened. In June 1953, when a hike in work quotas hit construction crews, protests began in East Berlin and swept across the country. Workers demanded free elections, lower quotas, and political change. Soviet tanks rolled, shots cracked. At least 50 people were killed, many more arrested. The uprising made 2 things clear: the GDR could not rely on consent, and the Soviet Union would not rely on hope. After 1953, the Stasi grew teeth. Informers multiplied. Passes were checked more carefully at stations that had once been sleepy. Still, The hole in the Iron Curtain called Berlin did not close. By the late 1950s, pressures converged. In Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev promised to bury capitalism and needed to stabilize his German ally. He demanded that Western powers remove their forces from West Berlin and sign a peace treaty that would end Allied rights in the city. In Washington, London, and Paris, leaders refused to let the island of democracy inside the GDR be swallowed by treaty or force. West Berlin's freedom had become a symbol far larger than its 2 million residents. In East Berlin, Walter Ulbricht watched factories hemorrhage workers, teachers resign, and letters home arrive from Frankfurt and Munich with photographs of cars and apartments. The GDR's crisis had an arithmetic. You cannot build socialism without workers. On 15 June 1961, Ulbricht answered a reporter's question with a sentence that would be replayed for decades. Niemand hat die Absicht, ein Mauer zu errichten. No one has the intention of erecting a wall. 2 months later, at midnight on Saturday, 12 August, GDR security forces moved with the speed of a secret long prepared. Barbed wire rolls and concrete posts came out of depots. Soldiers and police fanned out along the sector border. S-Bahn lines were cut. Street crossings were sealed. By dawn on Sunday, 13 August 1961, Berliners woke to trenches being dug in the middle of streets and coils of wire sparkling with dew where, the day before, you could ride a bicycle. Families pressed against the wire, calling to each other across a meter of space and a continent of policy. Some people jumped from apartment windows into firemen's nets held by West Berlin crews. Others dropped children to friends standing below on the west side. The messages on the loudspeakers used the word temporary. Berliners had learned to hear lies in passive verbs. In the following days, temporary became permanent. Barbed wire gave way to concrete. The first Berlin Wall was a patched line of cinder blocks and brick, 1 meter wide, built by bricklayers under police guard. Then came the death strip. Houses along the border were evacuated and later razed. A clear zone gave guards fields of fire. Floodlights and anti-vehicle trenches appeared. Rows of Stalin grass, steel angle irons sprouted at vulnerable points. Watchtowers rose at intervals with guards peering through slits, Kalashnikovs slung, searchlights ready. Orders were issued. Schießbefehl, shooting orders, authorized lethal force against Republik Flüchtlinge, those fleeing the Republic. A young border guard might be told he was defending peace. An old woman staring at the wire might have asked him to define peace. Checkpoints formalized what wire had asserted, at places like Checkpoint Charlie on Friedrichstrasse. The world's front line shrank to a boom gate and a hut. When the dust of August 1961 settled into concrete, Berlin learned how to live with a line. The wall did not just divide streets, it divided time before and after. Before, a tram ride to see your aunt. After, a letter that might arrive opened weeks late. Before, a stroll through MIT to buy records. After, a fluorescent booth at Checkpoint Charlie where even foreigners' passports felt like petitions. People adapted because people always do. The state adapted too, because the state had to. In the German Democratic Republic, the new border regime wrapped itself around everyday life. The Stasi grew from a ministry into a weather system, present even when unseen. Its officers recruited informers in workplaces and apartment blocks, logged whispers, mapped friendships, and filed them in serried shelves that creaked under paper. A Stasi file could record everything and understand nothing. The smell of a coat, a neighbor's laugh, a prayer. The message was not only that the state knew. It was that the state wanted you to know that it knew. Concrete also developed a routine. What began as barricade became system. An outer wall faced West Berlin, high, whitewashed, capped with a smooth pipe that defeated fingers and hooks. Behind it stretched the death strip, a cleared zone of raked sand, dog runs, anti-vehicle trenches, tripwires, floodlights, and patrol paths, ending at an inner wall that kept East German citizens away from the border guards' work. Watchtowers punctuated the line like metronomes. Orders authorized lethal force against border violators. Guards were told they defended peace. Some believed it. Some stared across the strip and saw a cousin's balcony and believed something else. Escapes did not stop. They changed shape. In 1962, Peter Fechter, a bricklayer barely 18, was shot trying to scale the wall near Checkpoint Charlie and bled out in the death strip as West Berliners shouted and East German guards looked on, an image that stuck harder than any poster. Others ran faster than bullets. In 1961, a young border guard named Konrad Schumann vaulted a coil of barbed wire in an early photograph that became a symbol before the wire even hardened into concrete. Tunnels sank under foundations. Tunnel 29, dug from the west in 1962 by students and masons, brought 29 people to daylight and headlines. Tunnel 57, in 1964, pulled 57 through before informers and police toppled its secret supports. In garages, families sewed a hot air balloon from bedsheets. In 1979, two households, Strelzik and Wetzel, floated into history under a silk sphere and a rising moon. A mechanic cut a car's springs so escapees could slide into a hidden cavity. A pilot stole a training plane and flew low over rooftops. Not every plan became a reunion. Not every failure became a headline. In the GDR statistics, Republikflucht was a crime. In family albums, it was a blank page with faces missing. West Berlin became an island by decree and a laboratory by accident. Protected by Allied rights and subsidies, exempt from West German conscription, and encircled by an adversary, the city grew an unruly grace. Students marched in the late 1960s. Artists made performance into politics. Clubs and squats thrived in Kreuzberg's shadowed courtyards. The underground train rattled through ghost stations in East Berlin, where armed guards stood on dim platforms and trains did not stop. Radio and television gave the lie to walls. West German broadcasts reached most of the GDR. Families gathered at night to watch Tagesschau on sets with the volume low, except in the valley of the clueless around Dresden, where mountains blocked the signal and propaganda found fewer competitors. The West listened to the East too, to whispered sermons, to banned songs, to the quiet defiance of a joke told 100 times. The formalities of division became routines that themselves felt temporary, then eternal, then temporary again. After Christmas 1963, under the First Pass Agreement, some West Berliners were allowed limited, supervised visits to relatives in the East. They lined up for hours, paperwork in hand, for permits that were favors, not rights. More transit agreements followed in the 1970s. West Berliners learned the currency exchange booth's peculiar arithmetic, Zwangsumtausch, a compulsory swap of hard currency for East German marks that could be spent in state shops, intershops, or not spent at all. East German pensioners were gradually allowed visits to the West. Teenagers were not. When an elderly woman cried on a West Berlin sidewalk in 1973, it was because she had seen her grandson for the first time in 10 years, and in 2 hours would be back on a bus with a border like a border again. Politics tried cautiously to make room for breath. Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik at the start of the 1970s, Brandt kneeling in Warsaw, treaties with Moscow and Warsaw, the Four-Power Agreement on Berlin 1971, the Basic Treaty between FRG and GDR 1972, did not remove the wall. It did remove some of the nonsense around it. West Berlin's status was regulated. Access routes were regularized. Embassies opened. The GDR joined the United Nations. The Helsinki Final Act, 1975, wrote 2 promises into 1 sentence: respect for borders and respect for human rights, and dissidents across Eastern Europe learned to point to the second as leverage against the first. Daily life advanced under the wall's shadow in ways that felt normal because normal was what people made when they had to. In the East, prefabricated Plattenbau neighborhoods rose, Marzahn, Hellersdorf, rows of concrete panels bolted into flats with central heating, kindergartens, and blackout curtains. Creches and after-school programs were plentiful. Sports clubs turned children into champions. East German swimmers and gymnasts won medals that smelled of chlorine and discipline. Trabis, tiny two-stroke cars, put families on waiting lists and, eventually, on weekend drives to the Baltic with tents and jars of pickles. Lines formed for oranges at Christmas. Intershops sold Western goods for hard currency to those with access. A folk joke defined socialism as the state that wins the race between shortage and propaganda by announcing victory. The state was not only shortages and jokes. It could be generous and cruel in the same paragraph. Doctors and childcare were available. The rent was low. The price for a book was a career. The Stasi had an ear at the table. Writers learned where the adjectives ended and the interrogations began. In 1976, the poet-singer Wolf Biermann was stripped of citizenship while on tour in the West. Protests signed by artists and professors followed. The state took names. Churches, protected by a bargain rooted in East German history, offered limited spaces where a conscience could breathe. Peace groups folded paper cranes. Environmental circles counted dying trees. The wall looked permanent. The decade did not. Cracks formed first beyond Berlin, then inside it, like frost working a hairline under concrete. In 1980, the world's most disciplined workers did the unthinkable. Polish shipyard crews in Gdansk put down tools and raised a banner, Solidarność, Solidarity. They negotiated in public on loudspeakers with a government that had never negotiated anything except surrender terms. Their demands were small and enormous at once: free unions, the right to strike, respect. Lech Walesa vaulted a shipyard fence and into history with a pen and a promise. For the first time in the Soviet bloc, a mass movement forced the state to sign a paper it did not want to sign. In December 1981, Polish generals in dark glasses imposed martial law. Tanks froze the streets. Leaders were arrested. Solidarity went underground. But the damage was not undone. A sentence had been spoken in the East that no censor could erase. We are the nation. East Germans listened. Radios hummed late at night. Samizdat leaflets crossed borders in jacket linings. Priests traded bulletins at ecumenical gatherings. The lesson wasn't that the state could be toppled. It was that the state could be embarrassed into sharing space. A union in Poland made a prayer circle in Leipzig feel less lonely. Then in 1985, a new man in Moscow changed the weather. Mikhail Gorbachev took the Soviet helm with 2 words and a calculator. Perestroika, restructuring, meant an economy that had stalled under the weight of tanks and ministries would have to be rebuilt. Glasnost, openness, meant you could not rebuild while pretending everything was fine. Newspapers printed problems. Party meetings used verbs like reform out loud. Old men scowled. Behind the words stood arithmetic. Oil prices had fallen. Afghanistan was a bruise that wouldn't heal. The USSR could not afford to hold up other people's ceilings forever. The Brezhnev Doctrine, Moscow's guarantee to intervene if a socialist ally wobbled, quietly retired. Gorbachev joked the new approach was the Sinatra Doctrine. Each country would do it its way. In Warsaw-packed capitals, leaders heard the sound of footsteps walking away from the telephone. East Berlin did not clap. General Secretary Erich Honecker, leathery and cert, had built a state on predictability. Unemployment was structurally impossible. Shortages were problems of distribution. The wall was anti-fascist protective. Gorbachev's vocabulary threatened more than policy. It threatened the habit of pretending. In 1987, he visited East Berlin and talked about acceleration and renewal. The SED applauded and changed nothing. At the GDR's 40th anniversary in October 1989, he returned to reviewing stands and fireworks. Crowds chanted, "Gorbai, Gorbai," and "Visa-free bis Hawaii," visa-free to Hawaii, under the noses of men who had policed slogans for a living. Whatever Gorbachev did or didn't say to, "Who comes too late is punished by life," became legend more than transcript. The message Berliners heard was plain. Moscow would not save those who wouldn't save themselves. The first physical cut in the Iron Curtain happened not in Berlin, but in a field between Hegyeshalom and Nikolsdorf. Hungary had been reforming by inches for years under János Kadar's goulash communism. mixing market elements with one-party rule. By 1988-89, the old guard was yielding to reformers, Miklos Nemeth, Imre Pazke, who concluded that fence mending with the West was cheaper than fence mending along the border. The 210-kilometer strip of electrified alarm fencing on Hungary's frontier with Austria had become obsolete and expensive. In May 1989, Hungarian border troops in broad daylight and before cameras began dismantling it. Wire coils fell, posts lifted, cutters clicked. Hungarians called it modernization. East Germans saw bolt cutters snipping their future loose. Word traveled faster than trains. East German citizens could visit other socialist states on vacation. That summer, tens of thousands took their holiday in Hungary, with suitcases that looked like immigration. Campgrounds near Lake Balaton filled with trabis and tents that had maps inside them. Families drove to the Austrian border and walked the fence line like tourists at a zoo with no animals. Border guards checked papers by the book and shrugged at the holes in the book. On 19 August 1989, at the Pan-European picnic near Sopron, announced as a symbolic open gate for a few hours, hundreds of East Germans sprinted through an actual open gate into Austria while Hungarian guards looked away or looked at their boots. It was supposed to be a gesture. It became an exodus. In September, Hungary officially opened its border to the west for East Germans. Floodgates are metaphors until you see one, and then they're not. The GDR leadership felt the boat list and pulled harder on the wrong oar. It pressed Hungary to close the holes. Budapest declined. East Germans who couldn't get from Hungary to Austria detoured through Czechoslovakia, which still held the line, at first. The courtyard of the West German embassy in Prague filled with tents and strollers. Then it filled with thousands more, faces turned up to a balcony where a foreign minister from Bonn, Hans Dietrich Genscher, appeared on 30 September and delivered a sentence people wanted so badly that they cheered before he finished it. "We have come to tell you today that your departure," the rest of the phrase, "has been agreed with the GDR authorities," was drowned out by joy. Special trains would carry them west. The trains ran through East German territory. In Dresden and other stations along the route, crowds gathered, some to shout goodbyes, some to try to jump aboard, some to scream at the state that forced them to choose between home and exit. Police swung batons, windows shattered, cameras recorded, sensors failed. Exodus has a politics. Every East German who left was a vote of no confidence the SED could count but not announce. Honker called them traitors and promised that the border would hold. On 7 October, the GDR celebrated its 40th birthday with parades and goose steps. Gorbachev stood on the dais looking like a man who knew cake frosting when he saw it. In the streets, police cracked heads. In private, Politburo members counted the days. On 18 October, Erich Honker resigned, pushed out by colleagues who feared a storm he could no longer read. Egon Krenz, younger but soldered to the same template, took the chair and spoke of renewal in a monotone. Meanwhile, a sentence that had begun in churches in Leipzig finished its clause. "Wir sind des are the people." Monday evening prayers for peace at the Nikolaikirche emptied into the streets. On 4 September, a few hundred walked. On 25 September, they were thousands. On 9 October, while the state prepared for a Chinese solution, whispered about after Tiananmen, 70,000 people filled the ring road with candles. Doctors stocked blood, soldiers waited for orders, party officials drafted statements. The order to fire did not come. The crowd moved like water around an obstacle and never broke windows. A banner read, "Kein Duell, no violence." Another, Freiheit. The Stasi filmed everything and understood nothing. That night became a hinge. A system that cannot shoot and cannot concede is a system that must move. Across the country, the pattern repeated, with local accents. In Plauen, Halle, Magdeburg, Rostock, people marched and negotiated their own restraint with police whose sons might be in the crowd. In East Berlin, the Alexanderplatz demonstration on 4 November brought 500,000 people into a square where only parades had been permitted. Actors, writers, and workers took a microphone and spoke like citizens, not subjects. Television, once a metronome of monotony, broadcast the speeches live. The SED promised reforms and produced committees. Krentz fired hard-liners and kept the line. The country ran out of patience before it ran out of paper. Meanwhile, the exodus did not stop. It shifted. After Prague, after Hungary, the only valve to open pressure without opening the system was inside the GDR itself. Reformers inside the government drafted looser travel rules. Bureaucrats moved paragraphs across desks like chess pieces. West German news crews set up in East Berlin hotels and waited for a sentence. On 9 November, the party's new spokesman, Günter Schabowski, walked into a press conference with a stack of papers, a bad brief, and a live feed to both Germanys. In his notes was a draft. New travel regulations would allow private trips abroad with permits to be introduced without delay. He read the paper like a man trying to find a light switch in a strange room. A journalist asked the question that would redefine a continent. When does it take effect? Schabowski peered at his notes, blinked, and said words that landed like a strike on an old bridge. Das tritt nach meiner Kenntnis ist das sofort unverzüglich. As far as on Monday evenings in Leipzig, the city learned a new way to breathe. It began in a nave, Nikolaikirche, under pale columns like palm trees. For years the church had hosted prayers for peace, a modest ritual where people whispered their fears into hymns and hoped the Stasi microphones caught reverence, not sedition. In 1989, prayers became a doorway. After the Amen, people did not go home. They stepped outside with candles cupped in both hands, the posture itself a promise. If you hold a flame, you cannot throw a stone. On 4 September, a few hundred walked the inner ring road. Police followed, filmed, and shoved. Plainclothes agents slipped into the crowd like stones in a river. On 11 September, it was 1,000. On the 18th, thousands more. They chanted Freiheit, and where Sindes are the people, a phrase that sounded like simple grammar and landed like a verdict. The security services lined up water cannons and dogs. Doctors at St. Georg Hospital were told to stock plasma. Operating theaters rehearsed for a night of shattered skulls that many feared would be East Germany's Tiananmen. The regime watched and slotted the event into its manual. The Stasi planned operative Maßnahmen, arrests, film, intimidation. The SED's regional boss, a hard man with a soft spot for orders, warned that any provocation would be met. Factories organized combat groups. Soldiers were placed on alert. In Berlin, Erich Honecker repeated the line that had kept him in power. There was nothing to discuss because nothing was wrong. In Moscow, Gorbachev came to the GDR's 40th anniversary on 7 October and got a cheer that wasn't for the host. Crowds yelled Gorbai, Hilf uns, and Visa-frei bis Hawaii, visa-free to Hawaii. Fireworks burst over the Palace of the Republic while riot police cracked heads on nearby streets. Whatever Gorbachev did or didn't say to Honecker, later polished into Wer zu spät kommt, den bestraft des Leben. The meaning Berliners took home was blunt. The Soviet umbrella would not cover a hard-line storm. On 9 October, Leipzig reached the ridge where one step becomes a fall or a vista. 70,000 people filled the ring road. Candles, prams, factory coats, students in denim jackets, pensioners arm in arm. Loudspeakers in party offices blared warnings. Factory militia waited in courtyards. Theaters, churches, and doctors had written an appeal for nonviolence and gotten it read on local radio by sheer persistence. Inside the Stasi district headquarters, officers sharpened pencils over arrest lists. Then something unusual happened in a system built on centralized commands. No one issued the order to crack down. The crowd moved, police lines pulled back, and a city walked around its own fear without breaking a window. That night did not topple the state. It proved it could be embarrassed into blinking. The Mondays multiplied. On 16 October, 120,000 marched in Leipzig. On 23 October, 300,000, almost a third of the city. Wer sind des Volk rolled off tongues like a drumbeat. Banners spoke in black humor. Gegen die Mauer im Kopf, against the wall in the head. Citizens' committees formed ad hoc. Pastors, stage managers, engineers, and lawyers met police chiefs and demanded what had never been demanded: dialogue, access, restraint. In some towns, Stasi officers were invited into church halls to talk and left sweating under questions that had never been asked out loud. Elsewhere, the chorus grew its own verses. In Plauen on 7 October, a demonstration of a few thousand was enough to plant a flag, the first large protest outside the ritual Monday path. In Dresden, embittered by the Prague trains roaring through its stations, crowds surged for days against police lines. Windows shattered. Beatings followed. The city learned to negotiate its own truce. In Halle, Magdeburg, and Rostock, the pattern repeated with local accents: candles and cordons, knees and batons, speeches on steps, and the slow education of both rulers and ruled in how to stand down without collapsing. The Stasi filmed everything. The tapes became a record of a state learning the faces of the citizens who would relieve it of its purpose. The SED's facade cracked and then shed bricks. On 18 October, the Politburo removed Erich Honecker. He had been the party's metronome for nearly 2 decades, gray suit, set jaw, the certainty of a bureaucrat who believed history was a filing cabinet. His replacement, Egon Krenz, was presented as fresh air and smelled of stale smoke. He promised reforms, condemned excesses, and phoned Moscow to swear loyalty to a vocabulary Gorbachev had transformed into something else. The public, newly trained to read between lines, heard no change. Trains south still carried people west via Prague. Churches still filled on Mondays. Passports still lay in drawers like broken promises. Then came Berlin's turn to speak in daylight. On 4 November, East Berlin's Alexanderplatz, a square built to receive parades, not petitions, filled with perhaps 500,000 people. Writers, actors, workers, and even a few party officials stepped up to microphones and said sentences that had never been broadcast live on East German television. Stefan Heym, the novelist, told the crowd, "Wir sind ein Volk, das sich regieren lassen will, aber nicht bevormunden." We are a people who wish to be governed but not patronized. Actress Ulrike Popp called for legal reforms. A young Stasi officer, invited by organizers, read a statement that squirmed under its own euphemisms while the square rustled with a hum that meant no. When a functionary tried to defend the party's past, boos swelled and then softened into a chant even the stage managers had not planned. Stasi raus, Stasi out. For hours the cameras rolled. In living rooms from Rügen to the Erzgebirge, citizens watched a conversation that the state could neither script nor stop. The pressure had structure now. New Forum, a civic movement founded in September and initially banned, printed leaflets faster than police could collect them. Citizens, committees occupied local Stasi offices, not to burn files in a righteous bonfire, but to prevent the Stasi from burning them in a hurried one. In some towns, the smell of wet paper and panic drifted from vents as shredders ate a quarter-century in hours. People brought thermoses and sat in chairs by doors with a sense that history had given them a night shift. At the top, the party groped for valves. It announced talk of a new travel law. It sent drafts between ministries. It wrote without delay on a paper and meant tomorrow. On the ground, without delay had already found its translation. Tonight. East Germans had been leaving by the tens of thousands via Hungary, and then via special trains from Prague. Those who stayed wanted dignity without departure, a passport to visit an aunt in Kassel, a permit to buy fruit in a market that did not stock slogans. The state tried to stay in control of the schedule. Citizens had learned that schedules are what you make when you're afraid of clocks. Monday the 6th came and passed with ever larger crowds. Tuesday and Wednesday brought new rumors, travel law tomorrow, reforms soon, and a press conference on Thursday about measures. Inside the SED Central Committee, men who had practiced certainty for a living shuffled papers and nervously smoked. The country they claimed to represent had already moved on. The wall still stood, grim and tidy with raked sand and fresh paint. Its purpose had begun to wobble. Its pride had begun to rust. On Thursday, 9 November, A party functionary walked into a press room with a sheaf of notes. His name was Günter Schabowski. He had not been in the meeting where the travel law had been finalized. The paper in his hand contained the sentence the regime hoped would ease pressure. Private trips abroad for East German citizens would be possible on application. The new regulation was to be introduced without delay. Under the lights, with a dozen cameras pointed at him and 2 Germanies watching, Schabowski searched the paragraphs for a date. A journalist asked the question that hovered in every living room. When does it take effect? Schabowski peered over his glasses and said, improvising the line that would become a torch. Does Tritt nach meiner Kenntnis ist das sofort, unverzüglich. As far as I know, it is immediate without delay. He meant the bureaucracy would open its windows in the morning. The country heard the border would open tonight. Phones rang. People put on coats. Crowds gathered at the checkpoints, not in a stampede, but as if heading to a concert they were afraid to miss. Border guards phoned superiors. Superiors phoned superiors. The ministry phoned no one because no one wanted to own the next sentence. At Bornholmer Strasse, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Yeager watched the crowd swell and his men's faces pale. For hours he stamped and sent people home. For minutes he let a trickle through. Then the math broke. Around 11:30 p.m., with the weight of 1,000 hands pressing against wood and habit, he made a decision history would eventually call simple. He ordered the barrier lifted. But that midnight belongs to the next hour of the film. The autumn of '89 had already done its work. It taught a people how to walk together without breaking, how to face uniforms without flinching, how to claim a square and then talk for real under cameras that could no longer be turned off. Leipzig's candles had trained Berlin's crowds. The evening began with paper and ended with concrete becoming air. At 6:00 p.m., the East German leadership sent its new spokesman, Günter Schabowski, into a cramped press room on Mohrenstrasse. He carried a folder he hadn't digested and a responsibility the regime didn't understand. For nearly an hour he droned through routine personnel shifts, trade figures, while reporters stirred. Near the bottom of his pile lay a draft travel decree hammered out that day. From now on, East German citizens could apply for private travel abroad more easily. Permanent emigration would be permitted through all border crossings. It was intended to take effect after agencies opened the next morning. No one had rehearsed the line that mattered. An Italian journalist raised his hand. When does it take effect? Schabowski squinted, thumbed the paper, and said the sentence that flipped a world. Does Tritt nach meiner Kenntnis ist das sofort, unverzüglich. As far as I know, it is immediate without delay. The words hit wire services like a spark in dry brush. At 7:05 p.m. DPA flashed. GDR opens border. West German newscasts led at 8 with anchors who could not keep their eyebrows from climbing. East German television, used to monotone certainty, carried the clip. Phones rang in kitchens. A father put on his coat. A neighbor said, just to see. People drifted toward the border not like a charge but like a tide. At Bornholmer Strasse, the checkpoint on a bridge spanning railway lines and a seam in history, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Yeager took the late shift with a headache and thin orders. His men had watched the press conference, too. Between 8:00 and 9:00 p.m., hundreds pressed up to the first barrier, waving ID cards and the evening's rumor. Guards called superiors, superiors called superiors. The line above them crossed its wires, allowed temporary crossings for particular cases, stamped passports in a way that invalidates them, and Entwerdung, so those who leave cannot return. It was a bureaucrat's trick that made exit an exile. Yeager tried the trick. A trickle stepped forward. The stamp, ungültig, hit the page like a cold slap. Some pulled back from the window, unwilling to lose citizenship for a night's look. Others shrugged, said enough, and walked through with hearts in throats. The crowd did not shrink. It thickened. By 10:30, Bornholmer Strasse was a human engine. The guards were shoving back, then letting a handful through, then shoving again. Parents hoisted children to see over wool and breath. The bridge flexed under 1,000 feet. Orders came down to push the crowd back. Then orders came down to close the gate. Then orders came down to let provocateurs pass to relieve pressure. Yeager stared at the white stripe across the asphalt and weighed what came next. At 11:30 p.m. he made a decision that would enter footnotes and then monuments. Wir öffnen die Schrank. We opened the barrier. The red and white arm lifted with an unceremonious click. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the crowd flowed, rushing, walking, weeping, laughing, hands up, hands out, hands holding hands. West Berlin police, stunned into smiles, waved people on and offered directions. Travis bumbled across, horns blaring like toy trumpets in a stadium. A man hugged a stranger so hard they both lost their hats. Cameras drank the light. Everything that had been ritual for 28 years, present passport endured the stare, except the crash of a stamp, turned theatrical and then farce. Guards at other checkpoints, seeing the news on West German TV and hearing the roar from their own streets, made the same calculation. Around midnight, Invalidenstrasse opened. Then Chaussee-Strasse, Waltersdorfer Chaussee by the airport. By 1:00 a.m., the map of Berlin looked like a sieve with lights moving through the holes. People did not only cross, they climbed. Near the Brandenburg Gate, West Berliners boosted East Berliners onto the wall's crown, boots scraped paint, champagne popped, sparklers hissed. Mauerspecht, wall-peckers, appeared with hammers and chisels and knocked the first wounds into concrete. The gate itself would not be an official crossing until December, but its quadriga looked down on a people who had decided protocol was a memory. A boy stood on the wall and cried without knowing he was crying. Somewhere in Bonn, the West Berlin mayor, Walter Momper, said on television, voice breaking, "Wir sind heute die glücklichsten Menschen der Welt in, are the happiest people in the world tonight in Berlin." In living rooms on both sides, television showed images that made grandparents grab the arms of chairs. Faces pressed against screens to find a cousin. In an East Berlin flat, a pensioner who had never seen Kudem at night put on her Sunday coat and a scarf and stepped into air that tasted like history. In a West Berlin bar, someone put on Beethoven and someone else shouted, "No, not that." And then everyone sang something with a chorus. Not everyone smiled. In the Central Committee building, men who had practiced power as posture watched the evening run away from them. Egon Krenz called ministries, ministries called border troops. The phone tree returned a forest of shrugs. There would be no Chinese solution. Moscow, when it picked up the line, offered congratulations and then distance. The shooting order that had never been admitted needed no cancellation. The guards had canceled it with gentle hands and looked away eyes. In the first hours, fear flared and died in stuttering moments. A clap sounded like a shot. A harboring siren froze a block, then turned out to be a tram that, for once, nobody minded missing. A West Berlin policeman looked at the flood and thought of crush hazards, then saw strangers grabbing strangers to steady them and breathed again. A guard at a small crossing kept stamping until his wrist ached, then stopped because no one was watching the stamps anymore. Some crossed to taste the West and went home before sunrise with oranges in pockets and eyes that could not close. Others slept on a cousin's couch in Charlottenburg and woke to the oddness of a different morning. The next day they queued at Kreissparkassen for Begrüßungsgeld, the 100 Deutschmark, welcome money. West Germany had been putting aside for this moment without knowing the date, and bought bananas, Beatles records, or a drill. A woman took the 100 D-mark and tucked it, unspent, into a Bible. A man bought chrysanthemums and took them home to put on a grave he had visited last in 1961. For the guards and for the Stasi officers who had watched a nation through keyholes, the night was a form of release and a beginning of audit. Some suffered breakdowns. Some drank. Some went home and slept like children for the first time in years. In the days that followed, citizens' committees would seal Stasi offices to prevent bonfires of files. On this night, the only bonfires were sparklers in mittened hands. Those who had tunneled and floated and died were not there to cross. People remembered them anyway. Flowers appeared at places like the memorial for Peter Fechter. Tourists who would one day take selfies were not here yet, Berliners carried the city over a threshold with grief and giggle in the same throat. And while it felt like the end of something brutal and the beginning of something better, it was also the start of a year of difficult choices. How to turn euphoria into law. How to fold an economy into another without breaking those who would bend. How to write a treaty for a continent. The answers lay in negotiation rooms and town halls, in currency exchanges and treaty tables. But none of those rooms would have opened without this night's hinge. A sentence, a crowd, a lieutenant colonel, and a barrier lifting like a yawn after a long fear. Berlin learned that walls fall two ways, all at once and because they have been unloved for years. The morning after feels like a miracle until it becomes a list. In the weeks after the wall opened, Berliners did what people do when history finally breathes. They went to work late, hugged strangers, took photographs, and then began to write down what must happen next. A country doesn't stitch itself together with sparklers. It uses ballots, banknotes, and treaties. First came the talk at kitchen tables and in rooms with microphones. In East Germany, round-table meetings gathered opposition groups, church leaders, and the disoriented remnants of the ruling SED. They made emergency law by conversation, free elections, a new travel regime, a ban on destroying Stasi files, and the promise that the state would belong to its citizens long enough for the citizens to decide what to do with it. Hans Madrow, the reform prime minister for the twilight months, tried to keep the shop open while the inventory changed every day. On 18 March 1990, East Germans voted freely for the first time. Turnout was enormous. The result was decisive. A coalition led by the East German Christian Democrats, aligned with Helmut Kohl's CDU in the West, won on the promise of quick unification and blühende Landschaften, blooming landscapes. Lothar de Maizière formed a government and sat down opposite Bonn to plan the wedding, not the courtship. The clock began to run in bank ink. The currency question wasn't a detail, it was the front door to reunification. Prices speak louder than speeches. On 1 July 1990, Tag der Währungs, Wirtschafts- und Sozialunion, the Deutschmark became legal tender in the East. People queued in the dawn light for their first crisp notes. Children clutched the blue 50 like a flag. Wages, pensions, and small savings were converted at 1:1, larger savings at 2:1, debts redenominated. The East German mark der Alu chip left pockets and vocabulary. Shop signs changed overnight. Oranges piled in windows that had once displayed only what factories could deliver. Along with the joy came a shock economics professors had warned about and families felt in their bones. An entire planned economy now had to sell its goods at world prices. Many could not. New institutions arrived with new names. The Treuhandanstalt, a trust agency, was created to privatize, restructure, or close roughly 8,500 state-owned combines and hundreds of thousands of smaller enterprises. It moved fast, too fast for some, too slowly for others, selling off steelworks and shipyards, breweries and bookstores. Efficiency improved on paper. Unemployment, a word that had been deemed impossible, appeared on notice boards. The East breathed cleaner air within a few years as filthy smokestacks shut. It also learned the weight of out of work. The border fell in stone. It rose in resumes. Meanwhile, diplomacy set the outer frame. Germany was still technically under four power rights dating to 1945. To regain full sovereignty and settle borders, the two German states needed the assent of the four occupying powers: the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France. The 2+4 talks, two Germanys plus four allies, began in May 1990 and did a decade's work in months. They settled that a united Germany would include both states, that its eastern border, the Oder-Neisse line with Poland, was final, that foreign policy would be free and sovereign, and that the Soviet Union would withdraw its troops, about 380,000 soldiers, from the former GDR by 1994. There would be no stationing of foreign NATO forces and no nuclear weapons in that eastern territory for the foreseeable future, assurances that mattered in Moscow's domestic politics as much as in Berlin's. The treaty was signed in Moscow on 12 September 1990. The occupation era ended with signatures, not salutes. Soviet consent had its own price in poetry. In July 1990, Helmut Kohl and Mikhail Gorbachev met in the Caucasus. Photographs show men in shirt sleeves walking in high meadows. Communiques record hard numbers, billions of Deutschmarks in credits and aid, support for housing Soviet troops returning home, and a timetable for leaving. The Caucasus handshake closed the last open question. A united Germany could be in NATO. Reunification was no longer a hope, it was a schedule. Back home, lawyers and legislators translated euphoria into articles. The basic law Grundgesetz had foreseen two paths to unity: write a new constitution, Article 146, or allow states to accede to the Federal Republic, Article 23, as then written. Speed and consensus pointed to accession. On 23 August 1990, the East German Parliament Volkskammer voted to join the Federal Republic under Article 23 effective 3 October 1990. The Unification Treaty Einigungsvertrag, signed on 31 August, spelled out the knitting. Federal laws extended east. The Länder, new states, Brandenburg, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, Saxony, Saxony-Anhalt, Thuringia, were recreated. Courts, administration, and social insurance were folded in. West Berlin and East Berlin became one city-state. Capital question would be fought another day and decided in 1991 in favor of Berlin over Bonn by a few dozen votes. On the ground, the year felt like scaffolding. Border installations were dismantled. The death strip became meadows and bike paths. The wall was chewed into souvenirs and a few memorials. The National People's Army, NVA, was dissolved. Soldiers were demobilized or integrated into the Bundeswehr after screening. The Stasi's offices were sealed and then opened to citizens in a process that would become a world precedent for file access. The Gauck Authority, created in 1991 and named for its first commissioner, Joachim Gauck, came later. In 1990, it was enough that the shredders had been stopped and the keys handed to neighbors. Town halls posted minutes. Mayors explained budgets under fluorescent lights. People learned the unglamorous civics of a free country, the right to be bored in meetings that mattered. Not all North arrows pointed up. Rents rose, subsidies melted. Life savings converted at set ratios felt thinner at the cash register. Ossi and Wessi, terms that began as jokes, grew teeth in office kitchens. But there were also scenes that made arithmetic feel like lyrics. A couple from Magdeburg driving to the Baltic without a permit. A grandmother from Marzahn stepping into a pharmacy in Wilmersdorf and crying at the sight of bright labels. A West Berlin student riding the U-Bahn through stations that, for his entire life, had been ghost stops and were now loud with ads and teenagers. Unity came with receipts and recipes, with bitterness and banter. At 1,000 small kitchen tables, people worked out what the news meant in rent and school districts, in cousins, visits and soccer allegiances. The last legal locks fell into place one after the other. On 20 September 1990, both the Volkskammer and the West German Bundestag ratified the Unification Treaty by overwhelming margins. The 2+4 treaty had already been signed. The The Polish border would be confirmed by treaty after unity to close a century's wound. At the chanceries and foreign ministries, diplomats put down pens and picked up toasts. The flag would change not in a palace but on municipal buildings, at midnight. On 3 October 1990, Tag der Deutschen Einheit, a country that had been divided longer than many of its citizens had been alive, became one state. In Berlin, fireworks flared above the Brandenburg Gate. In the pre-dawn, a small ceremony on the Platz der Republik lowered the black-red-gold flag of the Federal Republic that had flown over West Berlin, and raised a new one for a larger Federal Republic that now included 5 more states, and a history none of its neighbors could ignore. Orchestras played Beethoven. Politicians spoke speeches we remember mostly for the fact that they were no longer impossible to deliver in that place. The next day, work resumed. The first all-German election would be held on 2 December 1990. Helmut Kohl would win on the promise he had already begun to deliver. Soviet troops would dig foundations for housing in the east and begin to pack, slowly, then quickly, then suddenly all at once by the end of 1994. The German capital question would be decided in 1991. Government ministries would hire movers. Families would move too, some for jobs, some for love, some because the city that had been 2 was now 1, and had more room for dreams than for nostalgia. Reunification did not cure everything. It gave Germany sovereignty and a bill. It gave Europe the removal of its most potent symbol of division and a set of new questions about NATO, the European Community, soon the European Union, and borders that had once been wars. It gave Berlin a future none of its citizens had fully imagined, and a duty to remember that the way the wall fell, without a shot, with candles and a misread memo and a lieutenant colonel's courage, was as important as the fact that it fell. No one builds a perfect country by replacing. The fall of Jerusalem rang through Europe like iron on an anvil. 3 crowns answered. In Germany, Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa took the cross. In France, King Philip II. In England, Richard, newly crowned and already hungry for renown. It was a crusade of kings, money counted by mints, fleets ordered by royal writ, and an expectation that the West, armed as never before, would wrench the holy city back. Barbarossa chose the hardest road, overland. In 1189, his army, tens of thousands on contemporary lips, perhaps a disciplined corps of 12,15,000 fighting men, moved along the Danube, through Hungary and the Balkans, to Constantinople. Relations with Byzantium were brittle. Isaac II Angelos feared a Western army camped at his gates. After tense negotiations and skirmishes on the march, Frederick ferried his forces into Anatolia. The old emperor, nearly 70, led from the front. At Iconium Konya in May 1190, he smashed a Seljuk force and took the city, clearing the way to Cilicia. Then fate intervened. In June, as his column threaded the ravines near the Salef-Gurksu River, Barbarossa attempted to ford or bathe, sources differ, and drowned. A shock like that unstrings an army. Morale collapsed, disease and desertion scissored the ranks. His son Frederick of Swabia shepherded the survivors to the Syrian coast, but the German king's death stole the Third Crusade's heaviest hammer. The siege of Acre would become the crucible for the Crusades' other 2 kings. The place had been ringed since 1189, when King Guy of Lusignan, freed by Saladin after Hattin, threw a noose around the port and dared the Sultan to break it. Battle lines froze in a deadly embrace, Crusader camps choking the landward side, Muslim garrisons inside, Saladin's field army encircling the besiegers. Disease, mud, and hunger ground through both rings. From the sea, supply and hope trickled in, first contingents from the Italian cities, then the survivors of Barbarossa's column. Guy, eager to justify his crown, which many questioned after Queen Sibylla's death, needed Acre taken to prove he still ruled a kingdom at all. In the spring of 1191, the royal tide arrived. Philip II of France landed first. Richard of England was delayed by storms, a stop in Sicily, and a detour that would shape the East. the conquest of Cyprus. Blown to that island and insulted by its usurper Isaac Comnenos, Richard stormed ashore in May, captured the island in weeks and turned it into a logistical gem, grain, timber, a safe harbor for fleets. He wed Berengaria of Navarre there, then sailed to Acre under a banner that now promised a steadier supply line than any Crusader host had enjoyed since 1099. At Acre the kings brought order and rivalry. Philip backed Conrad of Montferrat, the hard, brilliant savior of Tyre. Richard backed Guy of Lusignan, the crowned loser at Hatton who needed a city to lift his name. Engines rolled, sappers dug. Crossbowmen on wheeled mantlets traded quarrels with archers on the walls. Mines were lit, towers groaned, garrison sorties fought like knife thrusts in alleys of rubble. In July 1191, after nearly 2 years of siege, Acre capitulated. Terms were stark. Saladin would pay a vast ransom, return the true cross, and hand over high-ranking captives. The Crusaders would release their prisoners when the first payments were made. Weeks passed, envoys rode, delays mounted. Richard, facing supply burdens, disease, and the need to move before autumn, made a brutal calculation. On August 20 he marched roughly 2,700 Muslim prisoners from Acre to a field and had them executed as Saladin's army watched from a distance. Medieval war had always bled. This was theater as well as punishment, meant to shock, to simplify logistics, and to warn the Sultan that stalling would cost lives. Muslim chronicles recorded the horror, Latin ones recorded the necessity. The crusade marched south. Richard's campaign from Acre to Jaffa showed a kind of genius that never touched Jerusalem only because it understood why not. The army advanced in a box, infantry shields and crossbows on the inland flank, cavalry poised behind, the coast to their right anchored by the fleet, which shadowed the march with food and water. Saladin harried them mile by mile, looking for a mistake, a gap to jam with horse and arrow. Near Arsuf on September 7, 1191, he found his chance, or thought he did. Clouds of skirmishers poured arrows into the Hospitallers and infantry on the inland side, trying to draw a premature charge that would unravel the march order. For hours Richard held his men with iron patience as drums beat and arrows whined. Finally the pressure snapped. The Hospitaller master, wounded and enraged, launched a charge to clear the tormentors. Richard unleashed the cavalry in support, timing the release like a spring. Knights crashed through, wheeled, and struck again. The Muslim line bent and failed. Arsuf wasn't annihilation, but it was a needed proof. Saladin's army could be beaten in the open by a disciplined advance and a sudden, controlled strike. Jaffa opened its gates. The coast from Tyre to Jaffa, the vitals of Outremer, were now secured. Twice in the months that followed, the Crusaders marched inland toward Jerusalem, once in winter to Beit Nuba, close enough for scouts to see the holy city's walls through rain and cloud, once again in summer 1192. Twice Richard turned back. His reasons were not cowardice but arithmetic. To take Jerusalem was one thing, to hold it was another. The army lacked horses and men to garrison a city so far from the sea. The roads would be cut. Saladin could starve them out and retake the prize with the first reversal. Winter mud swallowed carts, disease sat in tents, and politics, as always, bit like rats. For while Richard fenced with Saladin, he also fenced with Europe. Philip had already sailed home, ill and intent on carving into Richard's lands in France. In England, Richard's brother John stirred ambitions like embers. Every week spent before Jerusalem's walls risked losing a kingdom an ocean of land away. Richard tried an audacious diplomatic path. At Ramla and Lydda, he and Saladin's envoys, especially the Sultan's brother, Al-Adil, explored a marriage between Richard's sister Joan and Al-Adil, with Jerusalem as dower and a condominium over the holy places. It was clever theater, too clever for either camp's clerics and emirs. The idea died the death of anachronism, but it shows a truth. Both leaders preferred gains they could keep to glories they would lose. Saladin probed for weakness instead. In July 1192, he struck Jaffa by surprise and took most of the town. Richard, offshore with a small force, executed one of his wildest feats. Landing through the surf with a handful of knights and crossbowmen, he counterattacked street by street, barricading alleys and rallying garrison fragments until the city's seaward half held. Days later, on the plain outside, Saladin massed for the kill. Richard formed his infantry into tight blocks, crossbowmen reloading behind pavises while cavalry darted from the flanks. A feigned retreat, a sudden wheeling charge, and the Ayyubid line wavered. The Sultan broke off. Jaffa survived. By late summer, both commanders were exhausted. The Crusaders had secured the lifeline of the coast and proven they could not be ejected. Saladin had kept Jerusalem and most of the interior and proven it could not be taken without ruin. In September 1192, they concluded the Treaty of Jaffa, a truce of 3 years and 8 months, the coast from Tyre to Jaffa in Latin hands, Ascalon's walls dismantled, and crucially, guaranteed access for unarmed Christian pilgrims to Jerusalem's holy places. The cross would return to the sepulchre as a prayer, not as a banner. Richard left the east knowing what he had and had not done. He had not retaken Jerusalem. He had saved the shell of a kingdom, its ports, its arteries, and carved for it a breathing space. He had given the Latin East time to live, to trade, to fortify, and to hope for another chance. On his journey home, he fell into the hands of Duke Leopold of Austria, whom he had offended at Acre, and was handed to the Emperor Henry VI. The ransom demanded was colossal. England paid. Legend inflated. Saladin, too, barely outlived the truce, dying in 1193 in a house bare enough to make the point. He had spent his treasure on war and endowments, not on palaces. The Third Crusade did not restore the world of 1099. It did something subtler. It stabilized a frontier. It cemented the myths of two rulers who fought each other hard and sent each other doctors, fruit, and horses. It taught Europe a strategic lesson it would not always remember, that Jerusalem taken without a plan is Jerusalem lost in the next season. And it set the stage for a century in which coastal strongholds, Acre above all, would be the Latin East's lungs. But other forces were at work. Italian bankers and shipmasters counted coin. Emperors in Germany and kings in France watched each other with more hatred than they watched Cairo. Popes still dreamed of crusade, and merchants dreamed of contracts masquerading as vows. The next great army to march under the cross would not go to Jerusalem at all. It would follow debt and politics to the richest Christian city in the world and break it open. When the call for a new crusade went out at the turn of the 13th century, Pope Innocent III imagined a purified war, disciplined, papally directed, and aimed straight at Egypt, the key to Jerusalem. What he received was a story of contracts, debt, and diversion, where ledgers mattered as much as letters of indulgence. The Fourth Crusade would never reach the Holy Sepulchre. It would end, instead, with Christian swords flashing beneath the domes of Constantinople. The plan began sensibly enough. Gather the host in Venice, charter a fleet large enough to land an army in Egypt, and break the Ayyubid power at its root. Venice bid for the job with breathtaking confidence. Ships and crews to carry roughly 33,500 men and 4,500 horses, provisions for a year, all for the colossal price of 84,000 silver marks. The Doge, Enrico Dandolo, octogenarian, nearly blind but sharp as a hawk, put his city to work. Forests vanished into masts and oars, slipways groaned with hulls, warehouses filled with biscuit. The Republic paused trade for months to build an armada for Christendom. Then reality arrived. Far fewer crusaders than promised reached the lagoon in the summer of 1202. Some took other ports, others delayed. When the muster was counted, the crusade could not pay its bill. They were tens of thousands of marks short. Venice had emptied its calendar and coffers. It wanted payment in silver or in kind. Dandolo offered a solution just worldly enough to be irresistible. Help Venice capture a rebel city, and the debt would be eased. The target was Zara Zadar, a Christian port on the Dalmatian coast that had slipped from Venetian control into the orbit of the Hungarian crown. The Pope forbade it emphatically. No crusader soared against a Christian city, but hunger, debt, and momentum pressed. In November 1202, the crusader fleet filled the bay, banners unfurled, engines rumbled. Zara fell after a short siege. The sack was limited, but the violation was plain. Innocent excommunicated the Crusaders and the Venetians. Later he would lift the sentence for most of the host, but the moral stain remained. From the start, the crusade had been bent by finance. Winter in Zara brought a new temptation. A young Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, son of the deposed Emperor Isaac II, arrived with an offer that glittered like a shortcut to both money and mission. Restore him and his blind father to the throne in Constantinople, he promised, and he would pay 200,000 marks, provision the crusade, provide 10,000 Byzantine troops, maintain 500 knights permanently in the Holy Land, and submit the Greek Church to Rome. It was everything the Crusaders needed, and everything they wanted the Pope to hear. It was also a dagger pointed into the heart of a Christian empire still nursing the wounds of 1187. There were misgivings. Some leaders, most famously Simon de Montfort, refused and walked away. Many stayed. The army sailed east in spring 1203, not to Alexandria but to the Bosporus, to unseat emperors and collect pledges of gold. On the June horizon rose the city that had dazzled and exasperated Latin pilgrims for a century. Constantinople, ringed by the Theodosian walls, its harbors bristling with chains and towers, its skyline crowned by Hagia Sophia. The Crusaders established themselves across the Golden Horn, allied with their Venetian ferrymen. Fireships and boarding bridges clashed with the city's sea walls, assault ladders bit at landward towers. Inside, the reigning Emperor Alexios III, uncle and usurper, blinked in the light of his own irresolution. On July 17, 1203, the Venetians took a section of the sea wall. Crusaders forced a gate. Panic rippled through the palace. That night Alexios III fled with treasure. The city toppled in a scramble rather than a stand. The victors installed their candidate, Alexios IV, beside his restored father Isaac II. Then promises came due. The treasury could not yield what the young emperor had pledged. To scrape together payments for their allies, the new regime melted ornaments, taxed hard, and paraded union with Rome in ways that inflamed the streets. Latin priests celebrated in Hagia Sophia. Processions proclaimed papal supremacy. Byzantine pride, already raw from humiliation, boiled. Meanwhile, crusaders, unpaid and restless, camped outside the very city they had made and began to help themselves to its hinterland for fodder and firewood. Accidental fires, one of them catastrophic, consumed great quarters of Constantinople, feeding fury with flame. By winter 1203–1204, the alliance had curdled. Anti-Latin gangs roamed, palace conspirators whispered. A hard man rose from the shadows, Alexios Doukas, nicknamed Murtzouphlos for his heavy brows. In January he led a coup, deposing the Angeloi and taking the diadem as Alexios V. The young Alexios IV was strangled in prison. Isaac soon died. The new emperor rallied patriots to the walls and refused to honor the dead man's promises. He had a city to save, and no money to buy off an army he despised. The Crusaders, boxed between debt and rage, chose one last heave. In April 1204 they launched a full assault. Venetian galleys, their prows armed with siege bridges, smashed into the harbor walls again. Marines swarmed up, flags snapping, drums pounding. On land, towers creaked forward under a storm of stones and fire. For hours the defense held. Then a cluster of sea-wall towers fell in a rush, and a gate swung wide. Latin knights burst into the quarter, panic unfurled. Alexios V fled. On April 13, the greatest Christian city in the world fell to an army that had taken the cross for Jerusalem. What followed lasted 3 days. Chronicles from every side record scenes that sear. Palaces stripped to marble, silks and chalices piled like harvest, relics, skulls, splinters, caskets carried off to the west. The bronze horses that once crowned a hippodrome arch shipped eventually to St. Mark's in Venice, icons torn from wall, citizens enslaved, women violated even in churches. Hagia Sophia was profaned, its altar looted, its floor made sticky with crime. Pope Innocent, Learning of the sack, wrote words of fury and grief. Then, in the realpolitik of aftermath, recognized the new reality. A Latin patriarch would sit in the city. A Latin emperor would wear a borrowed crown. They parceled the corpse. A Latin empire of Constantinople was proclaimed. Baldwin of Flanders, courageous and mild, was made emperor. The Venetians took a lion's share of ports and quarters, islands and warehouses, vigilant custodians of profit. The Crusader barons divided what remained of Thrace and Greece into duchies and counties with feudal names that sounded strange in Greek ears. Meanwhile, Byzantine survivors established successor states: Nicaea in western Anatolia, Epirus in northwestern Greece, Trebizond on the Black Sea, vowing to reclaim what had been lost. From the Crusades' point of view, the ledger closed with ships, silver, and a throne occupied by men who owed the West. From history's point of view, it opened a catastrophe. The schism between Greek and Latin, brewed slowly for centuries, curdled into hatred. The Byzantine defense system, the fine web of diplomacy and power that had checked invaders for a millennium, was shredded. Although Michael VIII Palaiologos would retake Constantinople in 1261, the empire he revived was thinner, poorer, and haunted. A door had been opened that others would eventually walk through with ease. None of this had freed Jerusalem. The path to Egypt lay forgotten beneath ledgers and ashes. When later crusades formed, the fifth at Damietta, Frederick II's diplomatic venture, Louis IX's holy stubbornness, they would inherit a Levant where the Latin hold clung to a few strong ports and monasteries of stone. They would also inherit an Orthodox world that remembered 1204 more bitterly than 1187. If the Third Crusade had forged legends of knightly duel and negotiated truce, the Fourth forged a parable of how vows can be unraveled by hunger, pride, and debt. It is a story uncomfortable to tell and impossible to ignore. A crusade that never saw Jerusalem but remade the map of Christendom. From the quays of Venice, where contracts were signed in a counting house glow, to the nave of Hagia Sophia, where prayers were drowned by boots, the Fourth Crusade traced a line from ideal to appetite. And beyond it, on the Nile and in the hill forts of Palestine, the Mamluks were rising, soldier-slaves who would one day crush what remained of Outremer. If the Third Crusade had carved a breathing space along the coast, the century that followed would test whether breath could become life. Europe marched again, more than once. But while crosses were stitched anew, a different power was hardening in Egypt, forged from regiments of soldier-slaves whose discipline and purpose would, at last, close the book on Outremer. The Fifth Crusade opened with an old lesson half learned. Egypt, not Jerusalem, was the hinge. Take the Nile, the argument ran, and the Holy City would follow as tribute. In 1218–1219, a large army of crusaders, joined by contingents from Hungary, Austria, and the Italian ports, laid siege to Damietta, the gateway on the delta. The Nile fought for the defenders. Bridges of boats snapped, towers toppled. The tide itself seemed an enemy. Then the river fell, and after a year of mangonels and fevers, Damietta's walls cracked. November 1219, the city fell. Banners were planted, bells pealed in Europe. The victory brought a fatal choice. Egypt's Sultan Al-Kamel offered terms astonishingly generous: Jerusalem and wide swaths of Palestine restored, a long truce and the return of prisoners, in exchange for Damietta and peace. King John of Brienne urged acceptance, but the papal legate Cardinal Pelagius, stiff with principle and convinced Cairo could be taken, refused. In 1221, the Crusader host pushed up the Nile toward Mansoura. Al-Kamel opened dikes, fields turned to lakes, supply lines vanished into mud. Trapped in flood and encircled by Egyptian forces, the army capitulated, Damietta was handed back, and the crusade slunk away under truce. Pride had traded Jerusalem for swamp and lost. What swords would not win, diplomacy briefly did. The next crusade arrived without trumpets. Emperor Frederick II, excommunicated, learned, maddening, sailed east in 1228. Rather than battering cities, he bargained with Al-Kamel, now again secure. The Treaty of Jaffa 1229 returned Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth to the Franks. Muslims retained the letter 1E25 a M al-Sharif, Temple Mount, and military control of the approaches. Frederick crowned himself in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. No clergy officiated, then sailed home to face wars with the Pope. It was a truce written in ink, not in stone. 15 years later, in 1244, a storm of Khwarezmian mercenaries, displaced by the Mongols and hired by Egypt, swept down, sacked Jerusalem, and together with an Egyptian army, annihilated a joint Frankish-Damascene force at La Fourby near Gaza. The Latin East's field strength never recovered. A saint king tried to reverse fate by will. Louis IX of France launched the Seventh Crusade in 1248, again against Egypt. He took Damietta in a brilliant landing, June 1249, and pushed toward Cairo. At Mansoura in early 1250, impatience broke the plan. Louis's brother, Robert of Artois, charged through a breach with Templars and a vanguard, plunged into the town streets, and was cut off and destroyed. Days of brutal house-to-house fighting followed. The Egyptian army, trembling with palace intrigue after the death of its Sultan al-Letter 1E63 A Macron L.I. Letter 1E25 Ayyub, steadied under new commanders, including a hard-eyed officer named Baybars. At Faraskar, disease, hunger, and encirclement forced Louis to surrender. He ransomed himself for a staggering sum, yielded Damietta, and instead of sailing home in disgrace, remained in Acre until 1254, rebuilding walls, reforming courts, and wiring money and men into the skeleton of a kingdom that refused to die. While Louis rebuilt, Egypt remade itself. In 1250, the Ayyubid dynasty that had ruled since Saladin gave way to its own guards. The Mamluks, professional slave soldiers, largely Kipchak Turks bought young, converted, and trained in barracks along the Nile, killed the new Sultan Turanshah after a palace quarrel. For a moment, a woman ruled, Shajar al-Dur, the Sultan's widow, whose name echoes like a footnote of steel. Then the Mamluk emirs settled on a solution, their own. Aibak first, then after him al-Mu letter 1E93 a FFORQU letter 1E6DUZ, and beside them, rising step by deliberate step, Baybars. History, obliging no one, brought a second storm from the east. In 1258, the Mongol Ilkhan Hulagu sacked Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliphate, spiritual roof of Sunni Islam, fell. Aleppo and Damascus bent or broke. Franks watched with a mixture of dread and hope, signing truces with the advancing Mongols or opening their ports to them, wondering if the enemy of their enemy might become a savior. It was the Mamluks who answered instead. In September 1260, at letter 2 BF Ay in Jalat in the hills of Galilee, Qutuz and Baybars ambushed a Mongol detachment, used feigned retreat and tight reserves, and broke what had seemed an unstoppable tide. The Mongols would return in later years, but the spell was broken. The Mamluks had defeated the terror that had erased empires. Baybars took the throne later that year. Qutuz died on the road home, stabbed in a coup, and began to hammer the Latin East with a method that felt like fate. He built a courier post that flew news across his domains, reorganized armies, outfitted a navy, and tested each link of the Frankish chain. He preferred speed and surprise, treaties broken the hour they expired, and sieges that bled the garrisons white before a final storm. In 1263 he struck Nazareth. In 1265 he took Caesarea and Arsuf. In 1266 Safed fell after a grim defense. In 1268 he captured Jaffa and far to the north, the city of Antioch, the pride of the first Crusaders. Antioch's fall was apocalyptic. Its walls breached, its population slaughtered or enslaved, its ruler Bohemond vi powerless. A Latin principality that had stood since 1098 vanished in a week. Stone answered, then fell. The great castles, those stalactites of faith and fear, could not defy a state that had learned how to take them. In 1271, Baybars brought crack des Chevaliers, the Hospitallers' mountain ship, to surrender after months of pounding, and a forged letter that convinced the garrison their masters had ordered capitulation. Montfort and other towers followed. Acre remained, bulked by sea walls, Italian fleets, and a population as mixed as any city in the Mediterranean. The English Prince Edward, later Edward I, came in 1271 on what Crusade counters call the Ninth, raided bravely and negotiated a short truce with Baybars. It preserved the coast. It did not turn the tide. When Baybars died in 1277, the Latin East exhaled, then felt the breath catch again. His successor Calawan continued the work with colder patience. He tightened truces to buy time for cobbling siege engines. When terms lapsed or embassies failed, he moved. In 1285 he took Margat Markab, the Hospitallers' volcanic bastion guarding the Syrian coast, after tunneling and fire. In 1287 Latakia fell. In 1289, after a determined siege, the city of Tripoli, capital of the Second Crusader county, was smashed and burned, its harbor choked with wreckage, its people scattered. The county of Tripoli, carved from the stone of Raymond of St. Gilles's vows, became ash. Europe still tried. Louis IX had launched one more effort in 1270, the Eighth Crusade, but political schemes bent it into a landing at Tunis, far from Jerusalem. Disease scythed the camp. The Saint King died of fever on African soil, murmuring the name of the city he had not seen, Jerusalem. His death and the campaign's aimless end left Outremer with sympathy but without salvation. Embassies to the Mongol Ilkhans produced hopeful letters and occasional joint raids, but no grand pincer closed on Cairo. Italian fleets fought each other as readily as they ferried troops, and rivalries inside Acre, between communes, orders, and barons, turned the last sanctuary into a parliament of grudges. By the late 1280s, the map of the Latin East looked like a broken necklace. A few bright beads, Acre, Tyre, Sidon, strung along a coast ruled by ceasefires and tariffs, facing an interior that belonged to the Mamluk sultans. The military orders still rode. They would fight until the keys ran red, but numbers and logistics belonged to states, and the Mamluk state had learned every lesson war could teach. When preachers in Europe spoke of a new crusade, they were answered by budgets and dynastic wars. When envoys pleaded at Cairo, they were answered by patience and siege engines. Tripoli's fall made the end plain. Calawan turned next toward Acre, then the beating heart and market of what remained. He died in 1290 while preparing the campaign. His son Al-Ashraf Khalil took up the plan. Inside Acre that same year, a riot sparked by newly arrived crusaders, who attacked Muslim merchants during a truce, gave Cairo the pretext it preferred. The Franks had broken the peace. The great army began to muster. Timber was hauled, ropes twisted, stones shaped, iron shod. The roads behind the Mamluk host filled with carts and the hum of victory anticipated. 2 centuries after Clermont, Outremer had become a lesson written on stone. Courage without cohesion will buy time, not triumph. Castles without a country will fall when a country decides they must. And yet, the last garrison still looked to sea and counted sails. Pilgrims still came, weeping at the sepulchre. Merchants still bargained in the shadow of church towers and minarets. Children still played in alleys named for past glories. History's verdict had not yet been read out loud. The final chapter would be short, furious, and absolute. By the spring of 1291, the map of the Latin East was a string of bright beads on a tightening noose. Tripoli had fallen 2 years before. Along the coast, Acre, rich, quarrelsome, crowded, remained the last true capital of Outremer, its harbors jammed with Genoese, Venetian, and Pisan masts, its streets a babel of orders, communes, and barons. In the summer of 1290, newly arrived crusaders, undisciplined and eager, attacked Muslim merchants during a truce. Cairo demanded justice. None came. The Mamluk Sultan Calawan declared war, then died while preparing the campaign. His son, Al-Ashraf Khalil, finished the work. In April 1291, the horizon turned to wood and dust. The Mamluk host, tens of thousands, with siege trains that creaked like forests in motion, rolled down the coast and ringed Acre with a belt of earthworks. Engines rose, counterweight trebuchets whose slings could hurl stones the size of millstones, fire pots, and iron-capped bolts that chewed towers. Sappers tunneled beneath the curtains while storming parties assembled mantlets and scaling ladders. Behind them stretched the calm administration of a state that had learned how sieges are won. Engineers assigned sectors. Scouts marked weak points. Supply caravans pulsed like arteries from the Nile. Inside, the defenders were a mosaic. The king of Cyprus, Henry II, ferried over men and money and briefly took command, then sailed back to secure his island, leaving the city to its factions. The orders held the walls. Templars under Grand Master Guillaume de Beaujeu, Hospitallers under Jean de Villiers, Teutonic knights in their quarter. Alongside them stood the barons of the remnant kingdom and the quarrelsome communes of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. Refugees packed churches, merchants stacked bales, shipmasters loaded and unloaded in a frantic rhythm as if commerce could outpace fate. Acre's defenses were formidable, double sea walls, high landward curtains reinforced with towers, and outer suburbs like Montmusard in the north fortified as a second skin. The Mamluks set to work peeling those skins. Their trebuchets, named with piety and bravado, pounded day and night. Saps went in under the accursed tower and other key points. Timbers shored tunnels. Fires set beneath brought down masonry with a groan like thunder. The defenders replied with their own engines, countermines, sorties at night, and crossbow storms from parapets. For weeks the city held. In mid-May, the first major breach opened on the northern face near Montmusard. The Mamluks surged, the Hospitallers countercharged, the line buckled and sprang back. Jean de Villiers, fighting in the melee, took wounds that would force his evacuation. On May 18, before dawn, horns blew along the entire perimeter. Al-Ashraf Khalil threw in everything, storm ladders, rams, sappers lighting the last charges beneath weakened towers. The roar broke like surf. On the east wall by the St. Anthony Gate, the Templar Master Guillaume de Beaujeu rode in full mail to plug a gap. Arrows hissed like rain. One slipped beneath his arm through the seam of the hauberk. He swayed in the saddle, blood-soaking silk. Seeing him pull back, frightened townsmen shouted that their captain fled. He turned, lifted his visor, and answered with the line that would nail him into the city's memory. Je ne m'enfuis pas, je suis mort. I do not flee, I am dead. He was carried from the wall to a church, where he died at vespers. The breach widened. Elsewhere, the Mamluks forced the ditch and seized a tower. Defenders fell back to an inner line. Panic sprinted ahead of news. In the harbor district, terrified civilians surged toward ships, families shouting names against the crash of stones. Some vessels cut cables too soon and capsized under the crush. Others stood off the quays to avoid being swamped, filling boats with women, children, and wounded, while soldiers on land fought to the last yard to keep a corridor open to the sea. By afternoon, organized defense frayed into islands of resistance, Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic knights, and militia knots holding crossroads and gates for as long as breath and arms allowed. The Mamluk storm then rolled through the streets. A few commanders negotiated pockets of evacuation. Many could not. Fires broke out. Roofs collapsed. The clangor took on the dull edge of an ending. As the sun slid down the massed forests in the harbor, the city that had been Europe's eastern market and monastery became a slaughterhouse and prize. Some fought on behind stone meant for sieges of another age. The Templar Quarter, a compact fortress at the harbor's edge with its own massive tower and sea gate, gathered thousands, brothers, soldiers, townspeople who had not reached ships in time. They hauled up provisions and braced doors. Their galleys slipped out by night with evacuees as long as the sea gate held. Al-Ashraf, unwilling to feed men into a grinder, chose patience. Engines battered the Templar walls while sappers gnawed at the footings. After days of pounding, a negotiation opened. Safe conduct for women and children, hostages offered as guarantee. The first groups were ferried out under watch. Then something, panic, zeal, or treachery, snapped the thread. A Mamluk party that had entered as supposed guarantors was attacked. Fighting reignited inside the outwork. The Sultan ordered the tower taken. The final storm of the Templar keep ended in catastrophe for both sides. Undermined foundations, hammered by weeks of shot, gave way. A section of the great tower collapsed in a roar, killing attackers and defenders together in a tomb of dust and stone. Those who remained inside were cut down. A handful slipped out by sea with the last light. When the sun rose again, the flag on the Templar Tower was gone, replaced by the banners of Cairo. In the weeks that followed, the last beads broke from the string. Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, Haifa, some evacuated in haste, some stormed when their garrison sailed. The iron bastion of Shayd al-Pelerin Atlet, pride of the Templars, was abandoned and evacuated by night. Tortosa's island outwork at Ruwad would hold on until 1302, but the mainland was lost. The military orders regrouped offshore. The Hospitallers to Cyprus, then to Rhodes 1309 and Malta 1530. The Teutonic Knights turned their swords toward the Baltic. The Templars, rich and suddenly purposeless, would be destroyed by a king who coveted their gold and feared their independence. Acre's fall was more than a military defeat. It was the end of a world that had learned, however uneasily, to weave Latin, Greek, Armenian, Arab, and Syrian threads into a garment that could be worn at market and at mass. In its courts, a baron could plead the assizes in French while a Greek scribe copied the judgment in his own hand. In its churches and synagogues and mosques, prayers rose on different days under the same sky. The fall did not erase those people. Many fled to Cyprus or into Mamluk lands as artisans and merchants, but it ended the political experiment that had given them space. For Cairo, Acre was a vindication of the Mamluk system, discipline, logistics, and a willingness to finish what was begun. For Europe, it was a shudder and a shrug. Letters went out, pulpits thundered. A few expeditions launched short, misdirected, or too late. The age of monarchs riding east for Jerusalem was over. New wars and new prophets crowded the stage. On the quays of Acre after the storm, the Mamluks pulled down walls, toppled towers, and scoured the ground so that no enemy could make a nest there again. The sea lapped against smashed piers, lifting splinters and carrying them out into a darkening Mediterranean. Somewhere beyond the horizon, ships beat for Cyprus with survivors on their decks, soldier monks wrapped in blood-stiffened cloaks, widows with children asleep against their knees, merchants with keys they would never use again. The Crusader century had ended not with a banner planted, but with a city erased. 2 centuries had passed since a pope at Clermont had promised remission for a pilgrimage of steel. Between those cries and this silence lay Nicaea and Antioch, Hattin and Arsuf, parliaments of barter and nights of prayer, wax seals and broken oaths, saints and sinners and the stubborn hope of ordinary people. Acre's ruins wrote the last sentence on stone. The rest, memory, argument, and legacy, would be written in books. After Acre fell in 1291, the sea closed over the Latin East like a tide coming in. Galleys beat for Cyprus, chancelleries went quiet, fortresses that had claimed whole horizons were scraped to their footings. And yet the Crusades did not end so much as change address. The people who had lived beneath those banners carried them home in memory, law, debt, and legend. The aftershocks rolled on for centuries. Power shifted first to islands and orders. The Hospitallers made Cyprus their base, then seized Rhodes in 1309 and later still Malta, turning the sea itself into a fortress. The Teutonic Knights sailed north and built a crusade on the Baltic, casting stone into new snows. The Templars, rich, networked, indispensable, became victims of their usefulness. In 1307, King Philip IV of France arrested them, and in a trial that mixed envy, fear, and theater, the order was dissolved. Their banking methods and ledgers survived them. The idea of a transnational brotherhood with ports, vaults, and letters of credit had been proven. Finance had always stalked the Crusade story just behind the hymns. To move thousands across continents required new habits, indulgence taxes, crusade tithes, and papal legates counting coin, maritime contracts that split risk and profit between shipowners and investors, bills of exchange that let a pilgrim deposit wealth in Genoa and draw it again at Acre. The Italian republics did not invent their mercantile genius in crusade harbors, but there they refined it. Venice and Genoa built empires of warehouses and privileges that outlived Outremer itself. In the long run, those habits helped Europe look outward, first to Atlantic islands where sugar plantations took root, then across oceans. Warfare, too, learned new grammar. Concentric castles, rings within rings, became the late medieval ideal, a lesson hammered into stone at crack des Chevaliers, Belvoir, and Marcab. Siege machines grew in size and precision. Counterweight trebuchets hurled ruin with mathematical grace. Sappers mastered the slow art of undermining. On the field, the crossbow and disciplined infantry blocks quietly changed the balance between knight and foot. None of this belongs to one side alone. Byzantines, Latins, and Ayyubids traded techniques even as they traded blows. To tour a European fortress in later centuries is to walk hallways laid out by engineers who had studied Syria's hills. Knowledge did not flow only through tutors and courts in Spain and Sicily. The roads to the Levant carried it too. Arabic scientific and medical texts, Greek philosophy preserved and commented upon by Muslim and Jewish scholars, instruments and methods in astronomy and navigation. These seeped into Latin libraries through traders, translators, and physicians who had bartered remedies and manuscripts in acres' alleys. The compass and astrolabe were Mediterranean travelers. The numerals that made debellentry bookkeeping sing came from the same wide world. No one caravan delivered a renaissance, but the long tangle of contact mattered. The church learned hard lessons, then forgot some. Innocent III believed he could yoke penitence to policy and produce a holy instrument. Later popes learned to attach the crusade to causes far from Jerusalem, against heresies in Languedoc, pagans in the Baltic, rivals in Italy. The crusade as a specific pilgrimage with a single horizon gave way to crusading as a tool, indulgence-backed war in the Pope's register. Monarchs, who had once bowed beneath preachers' words, now bargained or refused. They built their own centralized states while papal authority crested and then ebbed. If Clermont had briefly made Christendom feel singular, the later Middle Ages made it particular. French, English, Aragonese, each crown counting its own costs. Relations among Christians were not healed by shared banners. The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204 tore a wound between Greek and Latin that centuries of polite theology could not close. When Byzantium fell in 1453, grief in the Orthodox world carried the memory of 1204 almost as keenly as the cannons of maimed II. The schism had not been born in the Crusades, but there it acquired flesh and anger. Meanwhile, in the Rhineland in 1096 and in later panics, Crusade preaching became a fuse for anti-Jewish violence. Bishops who tried to protect their communities sometimes failed, and Europe learned an ugly habit it would not soon unlearn. In the Islamic world, the Franks, al-Faranj, were remembered not only for slaughter but for contracts, truces, and a long, stubborn presence. Jurists wrote rulings on trade with them. Chroniclers measured their courage and their cruelty. Jihad, sharpened by Nur al-Din and Saladin and institutionalized by the Mamluks, became a language of legitimacy as well as of war. The Ayyubid and Mamluk states learned to mobilize logistics on a continental scale, to crack stone that thought itself immortal, and to keep the coast clear for centuries. When the Ottomans rose, they inherited a region whose military schools were rebuilt around these lessons. Not everything is ledger and law. The Crusades wrote themselves into story. Western romances filled with armored kings and desert sons, Richard and Saladin locked in a duel of honor that historians know was really a duel of supply lines and letters. The Holy Grail wandered into the mythic landscape. The Templars, first practical, then persecuted, became magnets for every whispered secret. In the East, the memory of Hattin and of Saladin's entry into Jerusalem became part of a moral identity. Victory through patience, magnanimity as policy, faith tempered by statecraft. To this day, political speeches rummage the past for those symbols. Crusade and jihad are words alive with centuries of echo. Their careless use can turn history into fuel. It is tempting to frame 200 years as a clash of civilizations. The record resists that simplicity. Allied patrols of Franks and Damascenes ambushed Aleppans. Venetian brokers priced pepper for Muslim caravans. Byzantine emperors bargained with Turks to check Normans while preaching unity to popes. In the same year, a Templar column might burn fields near Nablus, and a Frankish baron contract a Muslim mason to repair his gatehouse. Terrible things happened, many by intention, some by inertia. So did ordinary things. Markets open at dawn even after siege horns sound at night. Pilgrimage, which had lit the first fire, did not die with the last walls. Under the Mamluks and later the Ottomans, treaties and tolls let streams of unarmed travelers return. In 1342, the Franciscans were made official custodians of the Latin holy sites. Greek monks kept their own long vigils. Armenian clergy chanted in their chapels. The city that had been the center of war reverted to what it had been for 1,000 years, a place where people came to touch stone and weep. What then did the Crusades leave behind? A Mediterranean more entangled than before, a Europe that had practiced moving armies and money over oceans and that, in later centuries, would cross wider ones, a Near East whose rulers knew how to mobilize state power against stone and sail alike, a Christianity more fragmented in practice and more centralized on paper, an Islam whose scholars and sultans had found a common narrative in defense that would, in time, face new empires. And in between, families whose ancestors had been poolings in the Levant or merchants in Amalfi, whose bloodlines ignored the borders their chronicles defended. At the beginning of our story, a pope on a hill promised remission to those who took up the cross. At its end, on a hot morning in May, a sultan's cannonball shattered a tower. Between those two moments lies a human truth larger than doctrine or iron. People make meaning out of journeys. The Crusaders called theirs a road to paradise. Their enemies called it invasion. Their grandchildren called it legend. The roads met in cities that still breathe, Antioch, Jerusalem, Acre, and in books that still argue. If you stand today on the bluff above Acre and look out to sea, you can imagine the masts packed so tightly you might have walked from ship to ship, and beyond them the blue edge into which survivors disappeared. The wind off the water smells of salt and tar, of prayers and ledgers. Somewhere far inland, the twin rocks of Hattin crouch over a dry valley. Somewhere farther, the churches of Jerusalem hold cool shadows. The Crusades are over, but the dust of their roads still clings to the stones of two continents. And every time we ask what faith and power can do to one another, what they should do, we walk that road again.